on this computer. Okay, it's recording. You can turn live transcript on, enable auto transcript.
Okay.
Okay, so you can see like captions as I'm talking if you want to for some reason.
Okay, do I take notes or anything?
No, you don't need to. You could if you want to,
Okay.
but all right. So this is going to be our topic of the day. My name is Nhan Quach. Do you want to introduce yourself? Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie Vo. Sorry, my name is still like this. I just graduated high school, so my Zoom name is still my ID.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect. And just getting some preliminary knowledge. How much do you know about Asian American history?
I feel like I have a fairly wide knowledge of it. Well, my understanding is based on my own research on my own time. Of course, I don't know everything, but I do spend a lot of time trying to understand certain topics, especially within my friend group. We're kind of like, I don't know, I don't like using the word woke because I feel like it's so watered down. But like, I feel like I have a very educated friend group, like environment. So I try to like keep on, researching myself if I can.
Okay, that's very good, very good. Um, yeah, definitely have had a wide range of people who knew different amount of things about Asian American history. Want to see how much you know considering what you just said. And so this is going to be a topic about lost amongst worlds in Asian American history. Can you guess as to what the topic is going to be about, even though I kind of told you earlier?
Um, like through what you told me through text or like,
Yeah.
oh, okay. Well, I will make a guess since I kind of forgot, but it's like, um, I guess how, sorry, it's a little late, so I'm trying to like figure out what to say. Um, like through generations, we kind of, as through like Asian Americans, I guess, our culture is like, I guess, for lack of a better term, dying down because of like we try to assimilate to the Western culture. So then we kind of lose a bit of our like culture from our motherland or like from our parents because they don't really teach us. Or, like some of us, we don't really get taught that culture. So then it kind of gets lost as we throughout the generations, basically, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that wasn't what I told you, but
Okay.
very good
Sorry.
because you
Sorry.
have, yeah,
I kind of forgot.
you
I'm
have
so
a good
sorry.
idea of what we're going to get into. So keep that thought in mind. That's going to be relevant as we go along, but definitely not what I told you. So good. Don't
I'm
remember.
sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I opened that text during work.
All right. So next slide. All right. I'm just going to click on it. All right. So if you couldn't tell from the background I had earlier, this is Korea. And as we know, Korea in the modern age, we see Asian countries such as Korea, Japan, and China thrive with a prosperous economy. They're leading edge in their technology and they have a rich culture, right? So for Korea, for example, you have these traits such as their high-speed internet, their growing economy, their technology firms such as Samsung, and global phenomena like BTS, right? So why would you move away from Korea when you have Jimin and I wanted to say, I can't remember the rest of their names, singing down your throat every day in this glorious country, right? Like, why do you think people had moved away, especially under the context of like Koreans in America?
Um, well, branching off from what I said earlier about trying to be more, I guess, westernized, of course, this isn't like true to every single person, but it's like I see that within the media a lot, like especially within my own family. Um, I'm sure like Korean families can relate to um, that, you know, our parents and stuff, they want to become assimilated to the Western culture because I guess they see it as better. And they kind of like romanticize, like, I guess, America or Western countries. So they try to like move away from Korea. And it's kind of unfortunate, but yeah, that's what I assume.
Okay, so more in a modern context. I see, I see. So I kind of want to get into this idea of like a history, right? Are you familiar with the term diaspora, Asian diaspora, for example? Do you know what it means?
I can't like define that like I can't define like accurately, but
Uh-huh.
I get the concept of it.
Yeah, okay. So just to putting it into words for the sake of the recording, a diaspora is kind of the movement of people from where they had originated at one particular spot throughout a greater diffusion of area. In the terms of Asian diaspora, you see it happening primarily around the late 19th century from the home country onto more Western European areas, especially within America. And in the terms of the Korean diaspora, that began under the context of Japanese Empire. How much are you aware of that?
The relations between Korea and Japan.
Yeah.
I am aware that there are some tensions between specifically the government because due to World War, I forgot what war, not World War, it was a war. Was it World War Two? Oh my God, literally forgot. I'm okay. I'm not gonna answer that because I'm kind of stupid with that. But I know there are tensions because the history of like comfort women and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, and then the fact that the Japanese government like they try to erase that history. They kind of like reinvented themselves after that certain point in history. I really forgot when it was or like the context, but yeah, I know that there are like heavy tensions still today.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So just giving more context and more history lessons on that, right? Um, you can just nod. You're aware of the idea and terminology of like Western European Empire, colonialism, all those things. Yeah, so you see in Asia and other non-European countries around the pre-19th century era did this thing called not colonizing, which was really beneficial for these European nations which were edging on their borders of their tiny continent, who were like, we need more land. These places don't look like they need that land, and so they started taking that land. China and India are among some of the nations which you see befall upon imperialistic British hands, you know, as you can be aware of with Hong Kong or British occupied India. And Japan was determined not to follow the same fate as these other countries. Thus, around the late 19th century came about something known as the Restoration, the Meiji Restoration period within Japan, which consolidated the political power of Japan and transformed it into a unified, powerful nation, right? However, imperial conquest still occurred globally around this time, and with the US taking over Hawaii around the rise of the 20th century, Japan felt a huge wave of embarrassment for not doing the same to their neighboring countries, which were much closer than the US and Hawaii. This rose to imperialistic tendencies within Japan and the colonization of Korea and led to what you now know as comfort women and other terrible acts which Japan had done while occupying Korea. Decades passed with the Japanese occupancy in Korea finally ending, following Japan's defeat in World War II. Yet what followed was a Korea in ruins, divided between a North and South by demands from foreign nations and an overall uncertain future. From the ruins of Korea, we see the imagery of a desolate society, which leaves children struggling on their own and with mothers who seem like they cannot adequately take care of their families, right? And so just seeing those images, how does this make you feel? Does it seem like you want to help these people, like you should help these people?
Yeah, like these have images like in like within any context. You kind of feel bad. I'm just the type of person that kind of feels empathy for like people. So pictures during like time like war times or things like children like innocent people and behind them is like a tank or something like as graphic as like bloody bodies like photos like those yeah you just can't help but to feel like I guess bad for them and then you just want to help them so yeah so yes.
Yeah. And so if you did feel like you wanted to help these people, you kind of fell into the trap because first of all, this picture isn't even of Korea. This picture is of another nation following kind of the same conditions of the outfall of what happened in Korea, but these images are so prolific and so common around time of war, as well as war involving kind of developing nations, right? These images are termed as Madonna-Waif images by Laura Briggs, author of Mother, Child, Race, Nation, the Visual. And they're among popular tools of capitalistic nations who want to infiltrate the country and influence such nations. You see this happening in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Africa, Ukraine, etc. And the goal of such images is kind of to paint the natives of these countries as desolate, as needing help, as children, as mothers who can't support their children, who can't bring their children to the light of salvation or to civilization. Do you think these photos are kind of effective in doing such things?
I would say so.
Mhm. And so the issue with these images isn't that they're detracting from the suffering of these people. What they're doing essentially is that by having so many of these images be common and being the center point of the issues happening in this country, you're kind of distracted by the fact that the terrible conditions happening within this country are either started internally or had previously been caused by international affairs, such as Japan onto Korea. And so with these images being popularized within America, for example, you're just increasing the amount of international affair within the country and not letting the people of the country kind of have full reign of what's happening within their own nation. And so do you have any questions regarding that? Do you see that as an issue or why that might not be an issue?
So it's basically propaganda.
In a sense, yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
I do not have any questions. I think you explained it pretty well.
One of the big factors about these types of images is that they kind of paint war heroes to be Americans more often than not. So at least in the case with, say, the Vietnam War, you have the Vietnamese people either be overtly good or overtly bad, right? Like overtly with the South Vietnamese army, they are overtly good in our eyes as being, residents of Little Saigon, growing up, parents from refugees of the Vietnam War. But you see Americans being these complex individuals, right? These individuals who were either manipulated into going to war or who were a mixture of good and bad, a mixture of doing atrocities within Vietnam versus doing heroic acts within Vietnam, trying to liberate the country, quote unquote. For example, the My Lai village in Vietnam was desecrated by American soldiers who violated the residents in every which way possible because of accounts and beliefs that there were North Vietnamese Viet Cong soldiers within that village. But there weren't at all. Yet these American soldiers would continue to desecrate the village and they left it in ruins. This type of tension was publicized, but what the issue was is the fact that this was the only type of information kind of being spread around America, not really showing how within Vietnam itself, there's so much complexity to the origins of the Vietnam War. For example, we kind of see the Vietnam War as like a North takeover of South Vietnam, right? Does that sound correct to you?
Yes. I have a would you say the painting of South Vietnam as the good guys, would you say that would be like Western propaganda a little bit?
A little bit, especially considering the fact that South Vietnam was backed up by the US in terms of finances, war materials, etc. Something about the Vietnam War, which I think is relevant just in terms of our daily life as being kind of children or refugees from the Vietnam War, is the fact that the Vietnam War was somewhat started by the fact that the South Vietnamese, I kind of want to say Korean because of like talking about Korean, writing about Korean earlier, the South Vietnamese president at the time refused to reunite with North Vietnam following a countrywide election as to who would be the president of the reunified Vietnam following the agreement of the Geneva Accords of 1954, which led to the independence of Vietnam from France. And the South Vietnamese president backed off from the agreements of the Geneva Accords because it was Ho Chi Minh, Ho Chi Minh who won, which sparked the North Vietnamese march onto South Vietnam. And so, yeah, coverage of information like that, not as widespread, not as well known within America, because what we're being filtered through is that in Vietnam, people are suffering. The children, the wives, the mothers, the women, they're suffering. And American soldiers are the complex individuals inside the war who are mixture of good, mixture of bad, but you don't really see that within the internal Vietnamese population. They lack that kind of self-determination within the nation, and these Madonna-Waif images detract from that even more. So with these Madonna-Waif images, however, it attracted people to the belief that the residents of these foreign nations were needed to be introduced to Western ideology in order to become civilized, in order to make their way into salvation. And so this kind of combines with the pre-established idea of the white man's burden in the 19th century. Are you aware of what the white man burden is?
Can you explain it for me? I feel like I did learn this, but then I forgot.
Yeah. So the white man's burden was this concept that sparked within America following the late 19th century. It was around the time period of the Manifest Destiny, and when that was dying down within continental America, it spread towards America imperialistic tendencies, such as colonizing parts of Latin America, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The white man burden, essentially, like it itself as a concept, was the fact that white men were burdened to civilize the primitive residents, the primitive natives of such countries as the Philippines. And so what you see coming from the Philippines were a bunch of people coming to America to be kind of re-educated and introduced to Western ideology, and then sent back to the Philippines and kind of introduced those thoughts within the country. And so what these Madonna-Waif images combined with the white man's burden led to was the practice of international adoption. People such as Pearl S. Buck, author of The Good Earth, helped found international adoption agencies which took children from developing nations and put them into the hands of American families. It was a mixture of wanting to help the children, a key thought which Madonna-Waif images sought to put out, with the ideology that such kids could find no hope within foreign nations. Nevertheless, such images and such acts did encourage belief within American populations that they kind of were superior and civilized more so than foreign nations, and that these children would only find kind of salvation within America or within Western thought. However, the issue was, or kind of the more complexing part of this, was the fact that Korea did indeed find itself to be a willing supplier for these agencies. They would receive money from basically exporting their children and allowing them to be adopted by these international agencies because it brought the country money. Because while it is tragic that the country was in ruin, it's nevertheless the fact that the country was in ruin and in need of economic reprisal. And as my professor kind of put it, we kind of see and attribute South Korea's economic miracle as the result of its most important creation and export, its children. And you can kind of see that in the image right here, where there's a mixture of Asian kids with Pearl S. Buck. Any questions about that? Any comments so far?
So would you say that like white people that have this like kind of white man burden like complex, like they have like a savior complex and they see people from foreign countries as lesser? Is that like kind of basically their whole entire concept right now? And then would you say that it kind of kept on following and that affected why America got involved with the Vietnam War?
So to a degree, yes. I will say it's more of there's a separation between the common white American or the common American within the country and what's happening within the foreign nations. It's the fact that media and images are publicizing images such as these, which attribute to this kind of underlying subconscious perception of foreign nation people as weaker, as lesser, as these nations are perpetually not as well developed. Right? Like, for example, when we think of Africa, and I'm just asking this as like a rhetorical, you can also answer it or deny it, but at least for me, when I think of Africa, just because of everything I've been taught and raised to assume about Africa as being a third or a developing nation, I don't really see it as a place where there's tons of economic prosperity, tons of huge developing cities and stuff like that. That's kind of the imagery and kind of the thought being put upon other Americans at the time through such imagery as the Madonna-Waif images of foreign nations, which leads to kind of the infiltration and the influence of America within places such as the Vietnam War, because it's the assumption that if America didn't help out, they wouldn't, the Vietnamese people would suffer as had the Korean people did or as other nations did. And kind of tying back to like, why is it exactly that America went to war with these places thinking that they would help? It's the fact that America already had an idea of itself as this kind of complex individual with both good and bad parts. And it was kind of a feeling and a need to redeem themselves, rectify their sins, say with like colonizing the Philippines by liberating Vietnam.
Thank you.
Yeah. Does that make sense? Any of that confusing?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, so now the question is kind of life within America, right? These children, they're being adopted by American families, and that's kind of life for them, right? So now the question is, how is life exactly for them? And how do you think? What's your take? What's your guess? Mind you, too, this is like the 1950s.
Uh, well, obviously, it probably wasn't easy. I feel like a lot of they got adopted like around the age of like probably like past like toddler, like around that age, or like what's the age range? I feel like they would have different experiences depending on age range. If they were older, I feel like it would be a lot harder. But the younger kids, I feel like their heritage just got stripped, and then they kind of forgot like about their like culture. So then growing up, where there's like heavy racism, I guess they kind of got confused.
Uh-huh.
Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yeah,
That makes
yeah.
sense.
So in terms of the individual that we're going to talk about, she was adopted when she was about 2 to 3 years old, right? The age range for these individuals are typically on the younger side because, so essentially, in addition to images of like the Madonna-Waif images with the children, there was also a huge influx of this desire to have children within America. This ideology of the nuclear family became popularized around the 1950s. Are you aware what the nuclear family is?
Is it like I feel like this is wrong, but it's like a family of not four, but like um basically like a son, daughter. I don't. Is that correct? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. So a family of four, mother, husband, mother, father, son, daughter, and like
Okay,
a
got
pet.
it. Okay.
Yeah, so that's nuclear family. So the idea of the nuclear family became very popularized within America. People wanted to have the nuclear family. People wanted to have children. And so what came about that ideology and that thought from these Madonna-Waif images was not look at these children who need families. It's look at these children who can fill our empty families. Okay. So that's one aspect of the nuclear family and one aspect of adoption. In terms of the racism and everything about with these internationally adopted children, something to keep in mind is that when they are with their family, they're with like a predominantly white family. So they're kind of protected under that lens, under that guise, as they have individuals who are of like the American culture of the time, protecting them, raising them, nurturing them. But as a lot of critics of these international adoptions point out, is that you're basically providing these children a youth only to have them released out into the wild where systematic racism and other issues of racism aren't fixed, right? And so that kind of brings out another point of these international adoptions, which is more on the lighter side, which is that it raised questions as to like, what are we going to do about these people who are coming into our country who are not white? That's not as common as other things going on around the time, but mind you, this is the 1950s. We are going to the 1960s where a bunch of civil rights activism occurs. So who knows how much of an influence these internationally adopted children have on those conversations. But looking into the lives of these internationally adopted children themselves, we have a lens as to how life was for them through this woman right here. And her name is Deann Borshay, or Cha Jung-hee, or Kang Ok-jin. And it's going to be really important in a second as to why she has three names. So she released and filmed a movie known as The First Person Plural about her life being a child adopted from Korea by white parents. And you see many children being adopted from these countries were able to be integrated into their families from a youthful age because they fit the model of the nuclear family, which these parents kind of provided for them, or these parents wanted them to fit into their model of nuclear family. That top down, bottom up kind of fitting model. What you had the issue was that unlike nowadays, during the 1950s, cultural embracement of foreign cultures not as huge. It's not as easy to say like finding a jar of kimchi in Midwest versus like going down street in California and seeing an H Mart. So there's a huge disconnect for these children from their national heritage and their immediate social culture, right? And so for Deann, there wasn't anyone who looked like her or had shared same culture as her as she was growing up. And for her, she struggled to find her own identity. She is what John and Ruth Useem would call and coin as a third culture kid. That's a person who's raised under a culture other than their own culture of their parents or of their country's national culture. And what you see with these individuals is just a large scale set of inner confusion, inner turmoil, especially as they get older, because it's very difficult to wrap around who you are and what your identity is when you are being raised in an environment that isn't necessarily of people who are similar to you, right? For Deann, she spent a lot of her youth trying to look like the people around her, actively trying to do that rather than innately being that. And so as she got older, she went through this depressive period, trying to figure out exactly who she is. She also lost her ability to speak Korean because just of the fact that she was raised in America for so long without any presence to other Korean people. And this gets into this interesting part where I kind of mentioned to you earlier how she has three names, either Cha Jung-hee, Deann Borshay, or Kang Ok-jin. What you see happened was the Borshay family was supposed to adopt a child whose name was Cha Jung-hee. Deann Borshay, or the woman we're looking at here, is not Cha Jung-hee. What happened was Cha Jung-hee, the girl who was supposed to be adopted, was re-picked up, reparented by her father the day the adoption was supposed to take place. And so Kang Ok-jin was sent and passed off as Cha Jung-hee. to the Borshay family. And her whole entire childhood, all the way up into her adulthood, the Borshay family just figured that she was Cha Jung-hee. She did attempt to tell them sometime after she learned English, but the Borshay family kind of pushed it off, saying, oh no, it's like you were adopted, just adoption struggle is trying to not really fit in with the family. But it wasn't until she got older that she really figured out and really discovered the fact that no, she is truly not Cha Jung-hee. She is Kang Ok-jin. And that kind of just goes back into showing how a mixture of cultural insensitivity at the time, especially by these international or by these families who partook in international adoptions, as well as these adoption agencies who were primarily driven more by financial desire rather than any kind of moral obligations. She did, Deann Borshay did ultimately sometime in her future reconnect with both her biological and her adopted family by having them kind of sit in a room together with one another and interacting with each other. And from there, she began to really kind of untangle and figure out her own self-identity as this child who, this third culture child who was adopted by a white family, not exposed to her culture, and finally kind of rediscovering it so far late into her adulthood. So kind of right now, I know that was a little bit all over the place, but what do you kind of think about these international adoptions and kind of think about other things that happen with these children? I also want to mention the fact that like her family did love her, right? It's very clear in the video they did love her, but yeah.
I know international adoption can be kind of controversial because sometimes families do erase if the families are from different cultures. In this context, I'm going to use an American family adopting, like, let's say a kid from Korea or Asia. That is pretty controversial because they tend to not, because the idea would be like, oh, they're westernizing the kid who came from this foreign country, and then they're losing their culture, which is basically losing their identity. And I see a lot of like families like that, like on YouTube and stuff like that. I see like videos of like adoptions, and it's kind of like glamorized and almost like it looks like an accessory to some families. Of course, I don't think this applies to all families. I'm sure these families do love the children, but from a public eye, it does seem a little off. And sometimes I do feel bad for the, like, I can't help but to feel bad for the kid that they might have to struggle with their identity and like kind of erasing their culture. And I do understand that some families try to keep in contact with like their old families or people, or they surround them with like their culture. But yeah, sorry, that was all over the place, but do you kind of like get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
And kind of like, I guess on the flip side, what's your impression on these kind of adoption agencies, right? Like the agencies which take care of the adoptions, deal with the whole process?
um I guess it's complicated because I understand why families do have to give up their kids for adoption. It happens all the time, but like in the context of like giving them away to foreign families, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all. It's just that again, I have that same idea that I mentioned earlier, that I it does raise the concern of erasing the kids' original culture, because I kind of like, I'm not adopted or anything, but I kind of sorry, I can't, linguistic limitations,
Empathize.
yeah, with the kids, because I do struggle with like trying to keep my culture, and I have a Vietnamese family, so imagine the struggle it was for these kids who didn't have the family from their motherland, and they trying to like keep in contact with their culture. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so kind of moving on to the flip side, why are we on Reddit right now? I want to bring up a story that I remember a few years ago that I thought was relevant after listening to Deann Borshay's story. So it's on a subreddit, Today I Fucked Up, by the user. I'm not going to read it, and I prefer you not to look at it right now because it's going to be a spoiler. And it's kind of like a really funny but tragic adoption story. So this article was, it came out in 2014. The original post is deleted, but you can find it pretty easily if you just kind of look it up. So reading what I wrote down, rather than not tending to the national culture of their Asian adopted child, the Redditor and his wife attempted to raise their child as immersed into his native culture as they could. However, the Redditor did not care enough about the child's biological parents because they did not want to get too involved with the biological family's current predicament, you know, because the child's being adopted. You don't really want to get involved with the biological family if that's not what they want. So they didn't really know much about the biological family. For years, they tried to have their child be raised up in the Chinese culture, even though the parents themselves were not Chinese. They brought the child to a, as they described it, a very large Chinese population area over the course of 17 years. They brought him to learn Chinese in Chinese language schools, had him interact with adoptive Chinese aunts and uncles who would celebrate cultural celebrations with him, like, you know, Lunar New Year and all those types of things. And they would take him to China every 2 years since he was 8. The twist is, upon filling out his college applications, by the time this child turned 17 or 18, and needing to find his old adoption papers, the Redditor, the father, realized his biological parents' surnames were Park and Kim. The child was Korean. What's your reaction?
I feel like I heard the story before. Uh, I think that goes back to how sometimes these adoptions can go wrong and it can be very unfortunate. It's very though it's I guess it's ironic, I guess, or I guess it's funny to read, but in like reality, that's kind of like really sad to hear. I feel really bad for the kid, basically.
Mhm. I think it's kind of a personal testament, though, that the times are changing from going from like 1950s with Deann Borshay's story, where her parents didn't really make that much of an effort to raise her up in like Korean cultures or anything, or not even having access to those types of cultures and that type of like condition to raise their child in these communities, to now with parents being trying to like attempt to raise their child in their culture, except, you know, there's still a bunch of gaps and holes which needs to be covered. And also, like, as you mentioned, like the whole process itself can go wrong. It shows that like we as a society have made progress, but there's still more to be made. Yeah. And so kind of like now it's like, why did I tell you about these things? Why is it specifically these international adoptions and these third cultured children that I was talking to you about? Because I think personally it ties in a lot with us, right?
Oh, cute.
Yeah. As you mentioned earlier, like we are the children of Vietnamese immigrants, or we are Vietnamese immigrants ourselves. I'm a Vietnamese immigrant, and we aren't exactly separated from our culture. We live in an area where there's a huge Vietnamese population, as well as going to school with tons of Vietnamese students. I mean, like you can see clearly from this image, your class officers of 1 year were 3 Vietnamese kids and 1 Filipino kid. And so we're not exactly third culture kids. We're not children who were raised separated and segregated from our culture. We are children who are called cross-culture children. We are individuals who have interacted with multiple cultures throughout our childhood, but that raises issues, especially nowadays. We are individuals who kind of struggle to figure out what our own individual culture is. I definitely know I do, at least, because as much as I was exposed to Vietnamese culture, I definitely don't have that strong of like Vietnamese comprehension or being able to speak Vietnamese that well. I'm also like not as well versed as to like what it means to be an American because of how long I've been in Little Saigon and how many like legal loops and jumps we go through all the time being here. And so it's kind of like this issue where like me personally, like who am I? Like, do I really relate to, say, another person I know who is Vietnamese American? Do I really relate to these people who are like far off multi-generation, 10 generations in of Asian American? Do I relate more to immigrants who just came over? Do I relate more to people who are pure American? Do I relate more to people who are fully Viet? You know, who am I? What is my identity? That's kind of the issue we have right now, right? And so it's this evolution of what it means to kind of be like a minority individual within America. Asian American because of like how much we're talking about and who we are, but also just any type of minority figure within America who are cross-cultural, who are third culture, who are this and that, right? It's kind of a testament, one, onto how America as a society has evolved in being able to be more accommodating for these individuals and by being able to expose them to their cultures a bit more as they're young. But it's also another testament of how America hasn't really changed by not being able to fully provide the services to allow individuals of mixed heritage to really delve into that identity, right? And so we're kind of in the spot where it's a realization that this history is very recent, this history is still evolving, and we're kind of at the forefront of writing it and determining it as we're growing up. And so kind of like, what are your thoughts on that?
I also relate to having sort of an identity crisis. I didn't grow up in Little Saigon. Well, I spent a few years here, but I grew up, most of my childhood was in Texas, and there was a significantly less of a Vietnamese population there. My first language it is Vietnamese, but when I got into preschool, I started using English more and started losing a little bit of my mother tongue. And then now, I do have regrets of not learning it or asking my parents to teach me more because I'm not blaming this on my parents or anything, but I just wish that I grew up within the culture more because I do feel a disconnect to both the Vietnamese culture and American culture because at the end of it, uh, a lot of people see Americans as basically white people. So I don't really relate to like white people, and I can't say I fully relate to Vietnamese people as much as I want to. And yeah, I basically wish that I was closer to my Vietnamese heritage because it's not like too late for me to relearn everything, but um, it is definitely a struggle now since I didn't have that when I was younger. Does that make sense? I'm sorry, I'm not very articulate tonight.
No, it's okay. I get it. It's pretty late. So any final comments, concerns, anything about this?
um, about this specific topic.
Yeah. Anything that I told you about earlier?
Um, let me think. It was a very interesting lecture. Um, I think this just goes back into the whole identity thing for like, especially, I feel like this is very relatable to the Asian American youth because obviously I can relate to it, you can relate to it. I feel like most of us are going through the same experiences of like kind of trying to connect to our culture, but having struggles with that because of some of our families trying to, well, I don't know about like you specifically, but I know like a lot of people I know, and then me kind of, I'm trying to assimilate Western culture, and therefore, um, for me, for their children, kind of stripping away little by little. And that kind of scares me a little bit. I don't want to go into like, let's say if I have kids, um, I don't know how to teach them Vietnamese, and I feel like as generations go by, that language within my bloodline will like go away, and then they'll lose their culture. So that's like kind of a fear I have. So yeah, that kind of reminded me of that.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely feel the same thing. I definitely think that like a lot of this too, it's very ironic how, oops, sorry, it's very ironic how a lot of our parents want to be more immersed in this American culture and American ideals when it's kind of the reality is that a lot of us were pushed into this country due to Western influence kind of disrupting the progress of the countries that we used to be part of or that our parents used to be part of. It's kind of a mixture of confusion, a mixture of kind of unraveling where everything came from and unraveling what part of this do we want to be part of, I want to say. Um, and kind of just realizing that there's no way that like we can get any of this back. Like there's no way that like I could survive in Vietnam if I say I want to move back to Vietnam. There's also no way that like I'd probably survive in a sundown town or sundown city and anything else like that. It's just the fact that a lot of the history that our parents had to go through, a lot of the history that just predecessors as Asian Americans, as Asians, as Americans had to go through, lead us to the predicament that we're in now. And kind of just, we're stuck at this area where, how are our kids gonna be? What is the life that the people after us going to be? And what is the life for us in the next 10, 15, 20 years gonna be like?
I agree.
Yeah, and so I'm just gonna end it there for now. Thank you for coming by. Oh, and I also want to give one last credit to Melissa of the YouTube channel Answer in Progress for inspiring kind of topic, getting into the questions, the discussion that we had, and also pointing out the terms of third culture and cross-culture children, being able to define those terminology and use it in order to better describe the individuals that like you, I, other people who are facing kind of this dilemma have. And yeah, the channel's really good. They have a lot of interesting topics like olive oil fraud. So yeah, can end it there.
All right, thank you, Nan. That's